One arrow through the throat. That is all it took to kill 273 years of Viking dominance. September 25th, 1066, Stamford Bridge, England. Harald Hardrada, the last great Viking king, bleeds out in the mud while his elite guard dies around him with their axes still in their hands. Of the 10,000 Norwegian warriors who had landed days earlier, fewer than 2,000 will see home again. This was not defeat in any conventional military sense. This was extinction. The longships that had carried terror from Iceland to Constantinople sailed back nearly empty, their benches holding corpses wrapped in salt instead of living warriors. By sunset, the Viking Age was over, not gradually, not peacefully, but in one catastrophic afternoon of blood and broken shields that ended 2.5 centuries of northern dominance. This is the story of how tactical brilliance turned to fatal complacency, how geography murdered mobility, and how the greatest Viking warrior in history made the mistake that ended an entire era. But before we talk about the 8 hours that killed the Viking Age, you need to understand what died that day. By September 1066, the Viking Age had been devouring Europe for 273 years. From Lindisfarne in 793, when Norse raiders first slaughtered monks and burned their monastery, to this final autumn, the longships had written history in blood and ash across 3 continents. They had settled Iceland, Greenland, reached the edges of North America. They had carved the Danelaw from English soil, held Dublin for generations, ruled Normandy, founded the Kievan Rus. The very word Viking meant terror. Parents threatened disobedient children with stories of the Northmen. Coastal monasteries kept watch fires burning through the night. When dragon-prowed ships appeared on the horizon, entire populations fled inland, abandoning everything. This was not just conquest. This was apocalypse with oars. Consider the scale of what Vikings had accomplished. Viking raids and invasions had reshaped the map of Europe completely. They had forced the creation of standing armies, the construction of burghs and fortified towns, the development of new military tactics designed specifically to counter their mobility. Kings paid them tribute in silver by the ton, the Danegeld, hoping to buy peace that never lasted more than a season. The Varangian Guard, elite warriors serving Byzantine emperors in Constantinople, were all Norse. These men had carved their names in runes on the marble of Hagia Sophia itself. From sunrise to sunset, from the Mediterranean to the North Atlantic, the Viking long shadow fell across civilization. But by 1066, the age was dying even before Stamford Bridge. The last great Viking kings were old or dead. Settlements had become kingdoms. Raiders had become traitors. The fury that had driven longships across impossible seas was cooling into something more civilized, more Christian, more ordinary. Except for one man who refused to accept that the age was ending. Harald Sigurdsson. Harald Hardrada, the Thunderbolt of the North. Here is what makes Harald extraordinary beyond his reputation. He was not some minor jarl with delusions of grandeur. He was the real thing. Born 1015, exiled at 15 after his half-brother King Olaf fell at Stiklestad. The boy fled to Kiev, then to Constantinople. For 15 years, he served the Byzantine emperors as captain of the Varangian Guard. He fought in Sicily, Bulgaria, Jerusalem, across the Mediterranean. He earned a fortune through a combination of military genius, ruthless ambition, and methods that made even Byzantines nervous. The Byzantines, who had seen everything, called him dangerous. In 1045, Harald returned to Scandinavia with enough wealth to buy an army. He seized the Norwegian throne through a combination of gold, steel, and strategic marriage. For 20 years, he ruled Norway with an iron fist. He fought the Danes endlessly, crushed rebellions, expanded his territory, built his reputation. Every battle ended in victory. Every enemy learned to fear the name Hardrada. At 51 years old in 1066, he was possibly the most experienced warrior alive, veteran of more battles than most men could count. 6.5 feet tall, in an age when most men stood 5'6", a living legend who had never tasted defeat. Then opportunity knocked. Edward the Confessor, King of England, died January 5th, 1066, childless. The succession was chaos. Harold Godwinson, the most powerful English earl, seized the crown immediately. William of Normandy claimed Edward had promised him the throne, and Harold Hardrada remembered an old treaty. Decades earlier, Magnus of Norway and Harthacnut of England had agreed that if either died without heirs, the other would inherit both kingdoms. Tenuous legal justification? Absolutely. Flimsy claim built on a treaty involving different kings and expired circumstances? Without question. But Harold did not need a good claim. He needed an excuse. His real motive was simpler. Ambition. England was rich. Harold was greedy. He had won everywhere else. Why not add England to his collection? The strategic situation favored invasion. Harold Godwinson faced threats from two directions. William assembling an invasion fleet in Normandy to the south. Harold building his armada in Norway to the north. The English king could not defend both coasts simultaneously. He had to gamble. Throughout the summer of 1066, Harold kept his army in the south, watching for Norman sails. He bet that Hardrada would not risk a North Sea crossing in autumn when storms made navigation suicide for most fleets. But Harald Hardrada was not most commanders. He had sailed from Norway to Byzantium in his youth. Autumn storms were just weather. Harold assembled 300 ships. Conservative estimates put his invasion force at 10,000 to 15,000 warriors. This was the largest Norwegian fleet since Canute the Great conquered England decades earlier. Every ship carried veterans, berserkers who fought in drug-fueled fury, elite guards with mail that had turned Roman steel, young warriors hungry for English, silver, and glory. Harold brought his sons Olaf and Magnus to blood them in battle and show them how to take kingdoms. He also brought Tostig Godwinson, Harold's own exiled brother, who knew England's defenses intimately and carried a grudge sharp as any blade. The fleet sailed in early September. 300 dragon-prowed longships crossing the North Sea, sails full of autumn wind. It was a sight from saga and nightmare. The largest invasion fleet in a generation, commanded by the last great Viking warrior, aimed at England like a spear at a heart. Harold's confidence bordered on arrogance. Why would it not? He had won every battle for 20 years. He had defeated Byzantines, Muslims, Bulgarians, fellow Northmen. He was Harold Hardrada, the thunderbolt of the north, and he believed utterly that destiny favored him. He had crushed every enemy he had ever faced. England would be no different. The longships cut through grey water toward English shores, carrying the last great Viking army, carrying, though no one knew it yet, the final chapter of an age. The Norwegian fleet made landfall mid-September on England's northeast coast. Harold's force sailed up the Humber estuary, then the River Ouse, penetrating deep into Yorkshire. Harold Godwinson's gamble had failed catastrophically. The English king had kept his forces in the south, watching for Normans. The north was defended only by the regional earls, Edwin of Mercia and Morcar of Northumbria. Young men, inexperienced compared to Harold's veterans. They gathered what forces they could, perhaps 5,000 men, and marched to meet the invasion. September 20th, 1066. Gate Fulford, 2 miles south of York. The armies collided on swampy ground near the river. What happened next was a masterclass in Viking warfare. Harold's veterans fought with the discipline of men who had crushed Byzantine cavalry and Danish shield walls. The English were brave but outmatched. The battle became a slaughter. Norwegian axes carved through English lines like scythes through wheat. The marshy terrain turned red. Bodies clogged the streams. By afternoon, Edwin and Morcar's army had been shattered. Survivors fled. The earls themselves barely escaped with their lives. Conservative casualty estimates put English dead at hundreds, possibly over 1,000. Norwegian losses were minimal. York surrendered immediately. The ancient Viking city that had once been Jorvik, ruled by Norse kings for generations, opened its gates without further resistance. Harold imposed terms, hostages, supplies, recognition of his claim to England's crown. The city fathers agreed to everything. They would deliver 150 hostages to prove their submission. The exchange would happen September 25th at Stamford Bridge, a village 7 miles east of York on the River Derwent. A pleasant meadow, good roads, plenty of space for the ceremony. Harold accepted. Why would he not? He had won. Here is where it gets insane. After Gate Fulford, the Norwegians stopped behaving like an army on campaign. They started acting like conquerors at a celebration. Harold scattered his forces across the countryside to forage and rest. September was unusually warm that year. The warriors shed their heavy mail armor. 60 pounds of iron rings is miserable in unseasonable heat. They left it on the ships 15 miles away at Recall, where the fleet was anchored. At Stamford Bridge, the Norwegians lounged in the meadows enjoying the sun, waiting to receive hostages and tribute. Some sources suggest they had been drinking. They certainly were not expecting a fight. Meanwhile, 185 miles south, Harold Godwinson received the worst possible news. York had fallen. The northern earls routed. A massive Norwegian army sat in the heart of England's richest territory. The English king made a decision that defies belief even today. He would march his army north and attack immediately before Harold could consolidate his conquest. 185 miles in 4 days, through medieval roads with a full army in mail and weapons. The forced march was impossible. Professional soldiers consider 20 miles per day excellent progress for a medieval army. Harold's force averaged over 45 miles per day. They marched from London to York in 96 hours, covering ground that should have taken a week minimum. It was a feat of leadership, logistics, and sheer bloody-minded determination. Harold moved so fast that Norwegian scouts never detected him. The invasion force that had conquered the north had zero intelligence that England's king was even coming. Harold Hardrada, the veteran of 100 campaigns, had made the fatal mistake. He had stopped scouting, stopped preparing. He had won Gate Fulford so decisively that he believed the war was over. September 25th dawned, warm and clear. At Stamford Bridge, Norwegian warriors relaxed in the meadows on both sides of the River Derwent. The river split Harold's force. Perhaps half his army, maybe 5,000 men, lounged on the west bank near the wooden bridge. The other half spread out on the east bank. No one wore armor. Weapons were scattered. Some men bathed in the river. Others played dice. The atmosphere was festive. They were waiting for English hostages to arrive and prostrate themselves before the thunderbolt of the north. Around noon, lookouts on the ridge to the west saw something that turned celebration into nightmare. An army? Banners flying? Thousands of men in mail cresting the hill. English banners. Harold Godwinson's personal standard, the fighting man. The English king had covered 185 miles in 4 days and arrived absolutely unannounced. The Norwegians stared in disbelief. This was impossible. Harold should be in London. His army should be watching for Normans. But there they were, thousands strong, already formed for battle, descending the slope towards Stamford Bridge. Chaos erupted in the Norwegian ranks. Warriors scrambled for weapons. Officers shouted contradictory orders. The force was split by the river with only one narrow wooden bridge connecting them. Worse, their mail armor sat 15 miles away on the ships at Recall. Fighting without armor against a fresh army in full gear was suicide. Harold made a desperate decision. He sent riders galloping to Recall, ordering immediate reinforcements to come at full speed with armor. Meanwhile, he would form a defensive position on the east bank and hold until help arrived. But half his army was still on the west bank, and the English were already charging. The Norwegians on the western side fought without armor, without formation, without hope. They died quickly. English infantry cut them down in minutes. The survivors fled toward the bridge, the single narrow crossing that was now the only escape route. Here is where physics becomes destiny. The bridge at Stamford Bridge was perhaps 15 feet wide, maybe 30 yards long. It could accommodate perhaps 4 men abreast, certainly no more. It was never designed to channel an army under combat pressure. The fleeing Norwegians jammed the bridge in their desperation to cross. English forces pursued, cutting down the rearmost warriors. The bridge became a choke point of screaming chaos, and then something happened that would echo through legend for 1,000 years. One Norwegian warrior, a giant according to every chronicle, stopped running. He turned. He planted himself at the western end of the bridge with a Danish axe in his hands, and he decided that no Englishman would cross while he lived. What happened next defies belief, but every source confirms it. The lone Norwegian berserker held the bridge against the entire English army. For 30 minutes, maybe longer, he stood alone in the killing ground. His axe rose and fell in terrible rhythm. English soldiers came at him in waves. He killed them. 40 men. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle claims 40 English warriors died trying to get past one Norwegian with an axe. Their bodies piled at his feet. Blood made the wooden planks slick. Still he stood, not speaking, not retreating, just killing every man who came within reach of his blade. The English could not flank him. The river was too deep to ford and armor. They could not overwhelm him with arrows because their own men kept charging into the kill zone, blocking shots. They could not bypass the bridge because it was the only crossing for miles. One man had paralyzed an army through sheer refusal to die. Modern military analysts study this moment. In narrow terrain, numbers mean nothing. Skill, fury, and position mean everything. Finally, according to legend, an English soldier found a solution. He climbed into a small boat, floated beneath the bridge, and thrust a spear up through the gaps between the planks. The spear found the berserker's unarmored groin. He fell. The chronicles do not record his name. They just record that when he died, the English flooded across the bridge like an avenging tide. On the east bank, Harald Hardrada watched the English army pour across the Derwent. He had perhaps 5,000 men, maybe fewer, none in armor. The English force was comparable in size, but fresh, armored, and led by a king who had just achieved the impossible by appearing where he could not possibly be. Harald knew the mathematics. He knew this was death. But he was Harald Hardrada. He did not run from battles. He had never run from anything in his life. He refused to flee now, even knowing it was suicide. He sent more riders to hurry the reinforcements. Then, he formed his men into a shield wall, their shields creating a wooden fence across the meadow, and he waited for the English to come kill him. The English army formed up on the west bank after clearing the bridge. Harold Godwinson could see the Norwegian shield wall perhaps 400 yards distant across the meadow. He recognized Harald Hardrada in the front rank. The giant Norwegian king, even without armor, was unmistakable. 6.5 feet of northern fury standing in the center of his line, axe in hand, waiting. Harald made an offer. He sent heralds forward under peace banner with terms. Tostig, Harald's exiled brother fighting for the Norwegians, could have his earldom back. Full pardon, restoration of lands and honors, just abandon Hardrada and come home. Tostig asked what Harald Hardrada would receive. The herald's answer entered legend. 7 feet of English ground, or as much more as he needs, being taller than most men. It was an offer of nothing, except a grave. Harald Hardrada laughed. He told Tostig that Harald Godwinson was a better man than Harald had expected to offer such generous terms. But no, they would fight. The heralds returned. The time for talking was finished. The English advance began at a walk. Disciplined lines of men and mail, shields locked, moving steadily across the meadow grass. The Norwegians stood motionless, watching death approach. Without armor, every man knew he was already dead, but the Viking code was absolute. A warrior who fled battle was worse than dead. He was dishonored, erased, better to die with axe in hand than live as a coward. The shield wall waited. Around 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the armies collided. The sound was apocalyptic. Wood smashing against wood, metal screaming against metal, men shouting war cries in English and Norse. The Norwegian shield wall held initially through sheer determination and fighting skill. These were veterans who had crushed English earls 5 days earlier. But physics does not care about courage. Mail armor turns blades. Unarmored flesh does not. English weapons punched through the Norwegian line. Axes and swords found chests and faces and throats. The Norwegians fought with desperate fury, their own axes carving through English shields. But for every Englishman who fell, 2 Norwegians died. Harold Hardrada fought in the front rank. This violated every principle of medieval command. Kings were supposed to direct from the rear, preserving the strategic mind while subordinates did the dying. But Harold had never commanded from safety. He was a warrior before he was a king. His great axe rose and fell, each swing killing or maiming. English soldiers recognized him and concentrated their attacks. They wanted the giant king dead. If Harold fell, Norwegian morale would shatter. Around 3 o'clock in the afternoon, an English arrow found Harold's throat. Not his chest, protected by shield. Not his legs too low for effective targeting. His throat, the soft, vulnerable flesh where the windpipe carries breath and arteries carry blood. The arrow punched through. Harold Hardrada, the thunderbolt of the north, the man who had never lost a battle, dropped his axe and clutched at the shaft protruding from his neck. Blood poured between his fingers. He tried to speak and only managed a wet, choking sound. His legs gave out. He fell to his knees in the grass, then forward onto his face. The last great Viking king died drowning in his own blood on English soil. He was 51 years old. The psychological impact was immediate and total. Norwegian warriors saw their invincible king fall and understood in that instant that they were doomed. The shield wall did not slowly crack, it shattered. Men who had stood firm against impossible odds suddenly broke and ran. The retreat became a rout. The rout became a massacre. English soldiers pursued with the fury of men who had marched 185 miles for this moment. They cut down fleeing Norwegians by the hundreds. The meadow at Stamford Bridge became a killing ground. The river Derwent, which had been crossed so easily that morning, now became a barrier. Norwegians drowned trying to ford it in panic. Others turned to fight and died with their backs to the water. Harold's sons, Olaf and Magnus, tried to rally the survivors. Young princes doing their best to hold together an army whose heart had been ripped out. They managed to stabilize a small defensive position, shields locked, preparing to die with dignity. Then the situation got worse. The Norwegian reinforcements from Recall arrived. The riders Harold had sent galloping to the ships had succeeded. A relief force of perhaps 2,000 men came running up the road in full mail armor, ready to save the day. They saw the battlefield and stopped in horror. The king was dead. The army was fleeing. English forces controlled the field, but they had come 15 miles at a run, wearing 60 pounds of armor. They were exhausted before the battle even started. The relief force formed up and attacked anyway. These were elite warriors, the king's best men, and they would not abandon their comrades to slaughter. For an hour they fought, properly armored and formed, and briefly they stabilized the collapse. English casualties spiked. The relief force killed dozens, maybe hundreds, but they were outnumbered, isolated, and facing an enemy that had momentum and fury on their side. Slowly, inevitably, the Norwegian reinforcements were ground down. Their mail turned arrows, but could not stop axes at close quarters. One by one, the best warriors Norway had sent to England died in the afternoon sun. Tostig Godwinson fell during this phase. Harold's exiled brother, who had brought this invasion to England's shores, who had guided Hardrada to York, died with a sword through his chest. The English gave no quarter. This was not just battle, this was punishment. Revenge for Gate Fulford, revenge for the invasion, revenge for the terror Vikings had inflicted on England for 273 years. Every Norwegian who stood and fought was killed. Everyone who tried to surrender was killed. The pursuit continued until darkness made killing too difficult to continue. The butcher's bill was obscene. Conservative estimates placed Norwegian casualties at 6,000 to 8,000 dead out of the 10,000 to 15,000 who had landed weeks earlier. Bodies carpeted the meadow. The Derwent ran red. Literally. With so much blood that chroniclers commented on the color of the water. English losses were significant, perhaps 2,000 to 3,000 killed and wounded, but nothing approaching the Norwegian catastrophe. The cream of Norway's military elite had been annihilated in a single afternoon. As the sun set on September 25th, 1066, English soldiers walked the battlefield, finishing the wounded and looting the dead. Norwegian survivors fled toward the ships at recall. Most did not make it. English cavalry hunted them through the night. By dawn on September 26th, the killing had finally stopped. Fewer than 2,000 Norwegian warriors remained alive out of the mighty invasion force that had crushed York 5 days earlier. Harold Hardrada's body was recovered from the field. Even in death, even after hours of battle and looting, the giant king was recognizable. Harold Godwinson ordered him buried with honor in York. Enemy or not, Harold had been a king and a warrior worthy of respect. The English gathered the Norwegian dead in mass graves. The scale was too great for individual burials. Thousands of bodies, stripped of weapons and armor, were laid in pits and covered with earth. Modern archaeology has found some of these graves. Skeletons showing massive trauma, skulls split by axes, ribs shattered by sword thrusts, leg bones broken by the fall of dying men. The physical evidence confirms what the chronicles describe. Stamford Bridge was not a battle. It was an execution. On September 27th, the Norwegian survivors reached their ships. Olaf and Magnus, Harold's sons, took command of what remained. Harold Godwinson made an offer. The princes could sail home with the survivors. No pursuit, no further bloodshed, but they would leave hostages to guarantee they would never return. The Norwegian princes accepted. They had no choice. 300 ships had brought Harold's army to England. The survivors needed only 24 ships to carry them home. 24 ships out of 300. The mathematics of annihilation. The fleet that limped back to Norway in early October carried broken men and the corpse of their king. Harold Hardrada's body made the journey preserved in salt, wrapped in cloth that had once been a royal banner. He was buried in Trondheim with the honors befitting a king, but the sagas record the funeral as subdued, almost shameful. Norway had sent its finest warriors to England. Fewer than 1 in 5 returned. Entire villages lost every man of fighting age. The Norwegian elite, the veterans who had crushed Denmark and terrorized the Baltic, had been erased in 8 hours of English fury. Olaf and Magnus never spoke of their father's defeat in detail. The sagas that preserve Harold's earlier victories go strangely silent about Stamford Bridge. They mention it happened. They record his death with dignity, emphasizing his courage and refusal to flee. But the tactical disaster, the overconfidence, the fatal decision to scatter the army and remove their armor, these details are buried under layers of heroic poetry about dying well. It is the silence of shame. Norway had sent its thunder god to conquer England, and England had killed him like any other man, an arrow through the throat. 7 feet of English ground, nothing more. The immediate consequences rippled beyond Norway. Within days of the battle, word reached William of Normandy waiting in France. The English army that had annihilated Hardrada's invasion was now exhausted, depleted, and 250 miles away in the north. On September 28th, just 3 days after Stamford Bridge, William's fleet sailed across the English Channel and landed at Pevensey unopposed. Harold Godwinson, having won the greatest victory of his life, now faced the greatest threat. Here is where history becomes bitter irony. Harold had to march his exhausted, bloodied army 250 miles south to face a fresh Norman invasion. The men who had marched 185 miles north in 4 days, then fought for 8 hours at Stamford Bridge, now had to do it again in reverse. They had perhaps 2 weeks to rest, regroup, and gather reinforcements before William's forces were entrenched on English soil. Harold should have waited. Military advisors begged him to let the Normans exhaust themselves in siege warfare, while English forces recovered and consolidated. But Harold had just achieved the impossible at Stamford Bridge. He believed momentum favored aggression. October 14th, 1066. 19 days after Stamford Bridge, Harold's army faced William at Hastings. The English fought with the courage that had destroyed Harold Hardrada. The shield wall held against Norman cavalry charges for hours, but these were men who had already marched 435 miles and fought one apocalyptic battle. They were tired in their bones. When William's archers found gaps in the wall, when Norman cavalry finally broke through late in the day, the English collapse was swift. Harold Godwinson died with an arrow in his face, though whether through the eye, as legend claims, remains disputed. The king, who had defeated the last great Viking, died 3 weeks later to Norman weapons. Stamford Bridge had been a Pyrrhic victory. Harold won the battle and lost the war. But the larger consequence was the death of the Viking Age itself. This requires understanding what Viking meant. It was not an ethnicity, it was a lifestyle. Raiders from Scandinavia who took wealth through violence and settled foreign lands through conquest. After Stamford Bridge, this ended. Not immediately, not everywhere, but the organized large-scale invasions stopped. Norway's military elite was gone. An entire generation of warriors lay in English graves. The survivors had no appetite for further adventures. The ships that had carried terror across the North Sea now carried trade goods, wool, timber, fish. Peaceful commerce replaced violent raiding. The cultural shift was profound. Within a generation, Scandinavian kingdoms were fully Christian, fully integrated into European diplomatic and economic systems. The berserker fury, the death cults, the old gods who demanded blood, sacrifice, these faded into saga and memory. Young Norwegians who might have gone raiding instead became merchants, diplomats, farmers. The longship, that perfect raiding vessel, was replaced by the Nar, a cargo ship designed for trade, not terror. The transformation was so complete that by 1100, Vikings existed only in stories old men told. Some historians argue the Viking Age was already dying before Stamford Bridge. Fair point. Christianization had been softening Scandinavia for decades. Settlements had become kingdoms. Raiders had been evolving into nations. But evolution is gradual. Stamford Bridge was sudden. It was the moment when the last possibility of a Viking conquest died in blood and broken shields. After September 25th, 1066, no Scandinavian king seriously attempted to conquer England or anywhere else through Viking-style invasion. The age did not fade. It was murdered. Archaeological evidence supports the saga accounts. Excavations at Stamford Bridge have found mass graves containing hundreds of skeletons showing massive trauma. Skulls split by axes, ribs shattered by impacts, leg bones broken by falls or trampling. The bone damage patterns match combat injuries, not disease or accident. Some skeletons still have arrowheads embedded in vertebrae or ribs. The physical evidence confirms what chronicles describe. Thousands died here violently in a concentrated period. The battlefield archaeology tells a story of carnage that makes even the saga accounts seem restrained. Modern military analysis treats Stamford Bridge as a case study in how overconfidence destroys armies. Harold Hardrada made a series of tactical errors that compounded into catastrophe. He scattered his forces after Gate Fulford, instead of maintaining combat readiness. He allowed his army to remove armor in enemy territory. He failed to maintain scouts and intelligence gathering. He split his force across a river with only one crossing point. Any one of these mistakes might have been survivable. Combined, they were fatal. If you want to understand how one arrow ended 273 years of Viking dominance, subscribe to Medieval Battles immediately, because next week we are revealing the exact tactical mistakes Harold Hardrada made that compounded into catastrophe. The forced march tactics that brought Harold Godwinson 185 miles in 4 days, the bridge defense that held an army with one berserker, and why Stamford Bridge changed European history more than Hastings? So smash that subscribe button on Medieval Battles now, because understanding how the greatest Viking warrior in history made the mistakes that ended an entire era changes everything you think you know about overconfidence in warfare. And the lessons proven in that English meadow still influence modern military doctrine taught today at academies, where tactical brilliance without strategic caution leads only to extinction,